All right, everyone. Well, I might get started since we're a little bit 5 minutes already. So my name's Cassandra Sedran-Price. I've got a promotion today. I'm now the Chief Scientist, but I'm actually the Senior Research Manager at CSIRO, and I'm also an Executive Manager of my Muruwari Indigenous Data Sovereignty Collective and also a member of GIDA. So I'm really passionate today to be moderating this panel. The photo up there is also my fearless leader, Maggie. So I'm not quite sure what's happened today. A good start for the panel. But I'd also like to acknowledge country and acknowledge the traditional owners of the country that we are meeting today, the Turrbal, Jagera and Yagara communities that we are here and gathered on the lands. And I'd like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and First Nations people we have with us today. Okay, so what I'll do today is, like I was saying before, I'd like to have this as a bit more of a yarn and a bit more of an interactive session to what we've been having. So what we'll do is I'll get the panellists to introduce themselves in a moment. We'll ask a few questions and then we're going to hand it over to the audience. And so then we'll get you to ask some of the questions for the panellists as well. Okay, so today on the panel we've got Daniel from Aotearoa. We've got Jonathan over here as well, and then we've got Niklas all the way from Norway. So what I'll do is I'll get, starting from Niklas, to go through and introduce himself, and then we'll just come down the line to me. Thank you.
You want me to start?
Yes.
Thank you for the invitation. As I said that I respect the owners of the land and I acknowledge the rights, present, past, and future rights. So my name is Niklas Labba. I'm from Norway. I grew up as a reindeer herder, and I'm very grateful to be able to be here tonight, or this day. So I've been working in a Sami Research Institute since 2002, been doing some different work with the Sami Parliament. I'm not a politician, but research and politics goes very close to each other. I'm now leading a Sami Language and Cultural Center up in Tromsø, but I'm also a part of a research project called Interact. That's an infrastructure network between 70 and 80 research stations, and that's what I'm representing here today. Thank you.
Auntie?
Thank you, everybody. I'd just like to pay respects to the traditional owners on the lands that we are meeting on today. My name is Jenny Lynn Hamlet. I am a proud Wiradjuri woman from the Murchison, where the project, the SKA project, is being built. I've been working within this space for the last 10 years, negotiating alongside SKA and CSIRO to form the project which is called Inyari Mana Ilgari Bundara. It is in Wiradjuri. It means sharing the sky and the stars. The CSIRO, the MRO Observatory, which was established in 2009, is another project that's out on the country. The observatory site is now host to the construction of a mega science project, infrastructure project, the SKA with the low telescope. My role, I am the Community Liaison Officer within Wiradjuri. I acquired that role through our Indigenous Land Use Agreement. So I work in the space of Wiradjuri and the project. That's me.
Kia ora koutou. Hello, everyone. I would also like to pay respect to the traditional owners of the land, and I think it's been marvellous how much Indigenous representation also there has been at this conference. Heriti tēnei no Ngāpui, e Ngāti Pikiao, ko Daniel Wilson tōku ingoa. So my whakapapa or genealogical links are to Ngāpui and Aotearoa and Ngāti Pikiao. I teach in computer science at the University of Auckland there, and I'm interested in the social impact of technology, AI ethics, Māori data sovereignty and algorithmic sovereignty, and I'm involved in a number of projects in a number of different areas connected with those topics. So that and health and so forth. So a lot of the earlier presentations were very interesting for me. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Thank you, Daniel, and thank you, panel members. So with today, like we've been discussing a little bit this morning about Indigenous data sovereignty and the needs of our communities, one of the things that I'd like to start on is what value do you think trust plays in these dynamics and within the research infrastructure and the trust in research with our communities? Yep, Daniel.
Okay, I think, so trust is very interesting because, you know, you see in a lot of frameworks the importance of trust, but I think that how the term gets cashed out is different in different communities. So trust, I think there's a mainstream notion of trust, which is, you know, somebody persuades you that, you know, they'll uphold their obligations, but just what those obligations are, you know, in my research with Māori communities, there's a much thicker relational aspect to trust. So it's not just trust for a transaction to occur, rather it's trust that there will be the relational aspect, there'll be reciprocity, benefit sharing, that there'll be power balance, that there'll be appropriate cultural protocols, and so forth. So I think there's a much thicker notion of trust that needs to be embedded in order to have, you know, full engagement. Yeah. Kia ora.
And Arnie, would you like to speak about the SKO and the trust there that you've built with CSIRO?
Yeah, I think when we first started negotiating with CSIRO and SKA, trust played a big part because we as Indigenous people, we need to have that trust in the people that we're negotiating with because we have a lot of culture out there and we need to protect that culture. So I think once we got to the stage where we felt comfortable with negotiating with the government and CSIRO, we were quite happy to move forward with the project, and because you have to have that trust, regardless of who you're dealing with.
And how long has it taken for you to build up that trust?
We negotiated for 8 years. So in the end, we came to an agreement. We have an Indigenous land use agreement, which we have processes within that Indigenous land use agreement that actually protects us and it allows the other party to progress with the progress that they're doing. And that's what trust is about. If we can trust them, then they can use our country and then we can move forward. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And Niklaus, how does this fare for
I
you?
would say that trust is something that is built up by generations backwards. If I can go to reindeer herding, for example, in my area, we can see that from the early 19th century, researchers came in, like race biologists, and they tried to build up a picture of us as Indigenous groups that we cannot control our own land. So in one way, the roots for research has a very negative start for us. So to create a collaboration with researcher, it has taken the communities many years to trust the researchers again. And then trust builds also on the knowledge about that the result of what you give away to the researcher, that it will not be turned against you. So for me, when I've been working together with the Interact project for the last 10 years, we built up the trust. I have been a part of building up the trust between the community and the researchers. So in one way, to see that the result from the research has done something well. And we can see now that if we go back to 2002, or after the ICRI report, when climate change became a fact, it was human-made, then we can see the increased focus on Indigenous knowledge has really lifted us up to a higher level. So a part of why I'm here today is due to the effect of climate change, actually. So nothing bad that doesn't have nothing good with it. Is that our knowledge has been more lifted up a level, and we can talk in public arenas, tell about our knowledge. So of course, trust is a fundamental thing to create collaboration and to make good research.
Fantastic, thank you. And with building on that trust, and when you think about the data infrastructures now and just how long that's actually taken you to build, what do you think are some of the opportunities and even some of the challenges that Indigenous people face now with the current research infrastructures being built?
I think that we need to own our own databases, because we know that, as Maggie earlier talked about, this AI, artificial intelligence, will come. We know it will come. And we must protect ourselves that our data will be used as we want it to be used. So once more, it's about issue about trust. Shall we trust the one who has data about us? Or how can we protect our own knowledge? And how can we use something from this, or how can we use our own knowledge to improve our societies?
Fantastic. And Arnie, moving on from that, when you think about the mutual benefits and the trust that's been built, what do you think have been the opportunities for your people?
Well, I'll go back to our Indigenous land use agreement. When we negotiated, we instilled positions that were available for our Wurundjeri people. One of my role actually comes out of that, so that's a benefit, because that's taken me to South Africa and to Manchester, to where the projects are also partnered with. We spoke about it in the welcome today. So I've got that opportunity. We have field technicians that have come out of this project. They built those Christmas tree antennas, the 2,000 that set out on the country. So the opportunity is there. We have a lot of, that's the good side of it. So we made sure that we did get a benefit out of, we did get something out of the land use agreement, especially for our Wurundjeri people. So yeah, that's one of the things that helps us move forward.
And do you think that there were any challenges? Like, it took 8 years for that negotiation and that trust to build.
Along the way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there any that you can share with us?
Well, in order to move forward, we had heritage, surveys, surveying the land and making sure that our sacred sites are recorded, and, we have to, keeping them sacred first, and then once they're recorded and handed over, and then we can start the process. So heritage played a big part in one of the pitfalls. So, but we got over it and we dealt with it, and we are here and we're moving forward. Yeah.
Wonderful. Sounds like a magnificent project. And Daniel, did you have anything to add in some of the work that's been happening over in Māori Data Sovereignty?
Sure, yeah. With some, we've got, managed by Statistics New Zealand, the integrated data infrastructure, which connects all sorts of information from various government agencies. And one thing that's come out of various issues around census, which had a low rate for Māori in 2018, was an agreement called the Mana Orite Agreement, so it's equal power, from which a work program came out to partner with Māori in order to adapt the platforms in order to produce data that is useful for tribes to find out more about their communities. There's other infrastructure work going on at the moment. So Kiri Kōwhai presented a couple of weeks ago that they're also developing data centres that are connected up and down the country, but marae-based and local community-based connections. So that involves some investment in trying to build up that capability. Now that kind of connects with, there was a distinction earlier Maggie mentioned about governance of data and data for governance. There are also, on the other side, Māori-led initiatives to create, their own technology. I think Maui talked about the natural language processing that was going on, where you have communities collecting their own data. They have their own servers stored on their own land. They're completely in control. But there are also issues of ensuring that there are enough skilled technicians in these areas in order to be able to use this, that servers don't become just kind of standalone, just ensuring that all the technical supports and the people are there as well for these networks.
Thank you. So at the moment we've been discussing, the challenges and how long it takes to build trust around and also data ownership and, Indigenous owned data infrastructures. So I'll now just pass over to the audience to see if anybody has any questions at this point in time for our panel, and if you'd like to unpack some of the things that we've touched on so far today. Oh, in the front. I might just get you to stand up and introduce yourself and then ask the question.
Not that I need to know my name, but I'm Anita from Research Infrastructure Connected. My question is, obviously, trust initially is built through personal relationships. When you're dealing with government organisations over an 8-year period, generally there is movement in positions, so there'd be new staff coming on board. How did you, or how have you, or how have they dealt with maintaining that trust as they hand over from person to person in the organisation?
Auntie?
We had a negotiation team which went through the whole of the 8 years. We had 2 people sitting in the second row that actually sat at the same table with us, Rebecca Whedon and Ant Schenkel. So they walked the path with us for 8 years. So they knew the highs and the lows with the in moving forward with the project. So there was a consistency with the negotiation team. I was one of the negotiators, so that team followed through for 8 years and nothing changed. So we worked with these guys and they were always there at the table with us. So that's where the trust came in, because they had a team and we had a team of 15.
Thank you. And Nicholas, did you want to add anything to that comment about how you maintain trust over long periods of time?
I would say that was a very good question that you had, because that is a problem that we meet, that people change positions and then you're back in square one again. So you start to build up again. So we need to have some kind of system that secures that an organization becomes more, in one way, friendly for Indigenous people, because otherwise we will start to turn a squirrel wheel, that we will always go back to stage one again. And I think that we have now started to take steps forward, because I see in Scandinavia, for example, more institutions, more governmental organizations are starting to educate themselves in Indigenous questions. So it's up to us, the Sami community in my case, to learn these organizations how to be friendly, or how to secure that we're not going back every time there's a new person coming in. So we almost have to go down to the school system, and then to see that the communities must start to take responsibility for Indigenous issues, and on that way we can educate people.
And Daniel, did you have anything to add for that?
Not really, but there are issues with just this kind of short-termism, even in projects often, particularly in the university environment.
And the grants running out.
Yes, in particular, yeah. So it's easy to build trust when there's money on the table, but what happens when the money runs out and what gets prioritised is very important. Yeah.
And do we have any other questions from the audience on this topic? Yep.
Hi, I'm Elisa from the Nature Conservancy. My question is about this, what you just mentioned about most research grants are 2 or 3 years long. And taking into account and consideration that really establishing trust can take 8 years, 10 years, 15 years, is there a way for younger researchers that are applying for those short-term grants to expedite this process of building trust? If I am a postdoc at a university, for instance, and I am applying for a 3-year grant, is there an opportunity at all to engage with Indigenous communities? Or is this completely unthought of?
Daniel?
I guess the scale is a lot smaller where I'm from, where a lot of people know each other. So there's this element of personal networks. So if there are people who know you and vouch for you and trust you, and those people are trusted, well then, there's probably an in for a conversation. But it can be, there'll be a range probably of reception. So there might be some people who are very enthusiastic about what it is that you're doing, but there are others who, might be, there might be attempts to try and connect with them all the time. They might be overwhelmed. And so, there it might be a bit more difficult, but leveraging your existing networks might be a way to go.
And Nicholas, did you have much to add?
In the Sami case, I would say that an effort from a researcher that wants to research in Sami should learn the Sami language, to be able to talk the same language as the community that you are trying to reach out to. And then, of course, you must go to the community and ask what questions do you want to have researched on, instead of coming from the top and going down and say that, hey, I want to do this research. So in one way, to show that you as a researcher can actually do a thing that you can learn the language, to talk the same language as the people or community that you want to research in.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for that. And I've always heard this saying as well, that community moves at the speed of trust. And that's one of my favourite sayings, actually. So we might move on to the next couple of questions. So when we look at the historical or history of research processes involving Indigenous people, and I think Maggie touched on this morning a bit, that it's always been a bit extractive or from a deficit-based. How do you think research infrastructures can be developed or adapted to support more ethical, equitable and collaborative approaches? So Nicholas, did you want to have a think about that? Or also, we could also talk about some of the frameworks or mechanisms that might be able to be put in place to support those communities.
I think that the thing that I was talking about, this language issue, that you can speak the same language as the community that you are doing your research in. But I think that the communities also must develop some kind of organization or organize themselves to reach out towards the research communities and say that, hey, this is questions that we really need you to help us with. Some kind of a approach that really opens up towards the researchers also. So it's not just an infrastructure built on both parts, that the communities of Indigenous communities must be able to open up to meet the researchers, as well as the research community must accept the Indigenous communities. So in that way, we can have a collaboration that we can learn. We can build up new ways of moving slowly with trust forward.
That's great. And Auntie, did you have anything to add on there through the process that happened?
Well, under our Indigenous Land Use Agreement, we have 3 project agreements. We have an agreement under there. We have a project agreement. I think the main one is our cultural heritage management plan. It's basically the Bible out on the country on where the project is. It tells people where they can and can't go. We have preservation areas out there. So a lot of our cultural places are recorded, when we do heritage. So a lot of our data is stored and it goes to CSIRO and it's all packaged. So our data is always kept, so everybody knows where everything is out there.
Yep. And there's strong processes.
They are strong processes, so if they breach the processes, then we do have a problem, but we haven't had a problem so far. So, yeah, as long as you have your strong framework structure within the ICRI, it'll work. So, and that's what we feel, and we always go back to trust. As long as we have that, the framework is set. Yeah.
Fantastic. And how about in Aotearoa, do you have many different frameworks that can support some of like land use agreements or data control or ownership and things like that, Daniel?
Yeah, actually, so Maui in the audience would, he's been developing a bunch of these. We've also been sort of working on projects in relation to things like Māori algorithmic sovereignty, having principles, but Maui's worked on Māori data sovereignty principles, also, ethical guidelines around sort of genetic information. There are a heap of frameworks, but as was pointed out, there's also how do you operationalise these? That's sort of a gap of making sure that there's the right policies and tools and having the right governance mechanisms in place in order to make these effective. Yeah.
And how do you find the capability and capacity building over there for both non-Indigenous and Indigenous people within your country to learn about these frameworks?
So there is a lot of interest from government organisations, but in terms of, really the rubber hits the road when people are involved in projects. There are a number of case studies where these things might work well, but there are also good intentions that don't get realised effectively. So, for example, where I work, there's been an intention to be a Māori Data Sovereignty Research Institute, but sometimes, as was referred to earlier, so Maggie mentioned this, they're sort of redefining what is included. If you're talking about Māori data sovereignty, or what is included in that, sometimes it gets boxed into making sure the data's stored locally, for instance. So you've got this jurisdictional aspect. So it's uneven, and it's a bit of a negotiation, and there's a bit of trying to get power shared, I guess, is the ultimate thing. That's a difficult thing to do. Yeah.
Power sharing, definitely. So I'll just hand it back over to the audience, and if you have any questions for our panel members.
Thank you. Kate Barnard here from Astronomy Australia. You've mentioned one of the challenges that comes up is that often people will get overwhelmed. There are, like, we will come to Indigenous people and say, we want you to talk about this, and we want your help with this, and we want you to be involved in this. So there's a tension with that demand of kind of trying to have involvement, engagement with Indigenous communities, but also ensuring that balance. One that Maggie, I think this morning, mentioned, she said we can't do it all ourselves. Come on, like the non-Indigenous community, you've really got to step up and do a lot of this work. So could you talk about that balance of ensuring that we're not overburdening Indigenous communities while appropriately engaging Indigenous communities?
Who wants to take that one? I want to take that one, but I won't. Anyway.
I can try to answer it. In the 70s, they used to laugh up in Kautokeino, it's up in northern Norway, that the traditional Sami family is a wife, a husband, and a dog, and an anthropologist. Today, European Union, they are actually founding projects to get rid of or try to solve these kind of problems, to make hubs where researchers can go together and say that, hey, we can't overload the Indigenous communities. So they try to get stakeholders groups from Indigenous communities to work together closer to research groups, so they can actually select what kind of questions they want to be a part of discussing. So in one way, I think that EU is doing now is perhaps one of the ways forward to get away from this problem that was in the 70s in Kautokeino.
Would anybody else like to add to?
Yeah, it can be tricky, but it can be also, it depends who you get, right? Because some people, if you're talking to them about projects where they can see the benefit for them and that it'll be shaped in that way, well, then there can be an enthusiasm. But sometimes there's just not enough bandwidth, and particularly in universities, there are also, Māori researchers who get called on, and you end up with the same people who might have the skills in the community who get called on for all these various projects, and they just sort of, there's only limited bandwidth. They just have to let things go. So, don't take it personal when you don't get the response that you like. It could just be a bandwidth issue. But there are also things around, you know, it's not just sort of building cultural competency that helps, but also just sort of this cultural safety element, like what is it to be a good partner, you know, what's going to serve the needs of who it is that you want to work with. If it's not going to serve their needs, well then, you know, there's no sort of benefit to be realised there. So yeah, I guess that's all I have to add to that one.
Yeah, definitely having that shifting the priorities to benefit the community and what can this project bring from or support the community, and that's a really good one. And Auntie, did you have anything you wanted to share about your project, any of your projects in particular where, well, you did a little bit this morning already about, you know, the benefit of the field officers and stuff, but did you see any other benefits that these projects could bring to your communities?
No, ours is just a work in progress at the moment. So once the project's up and running properly, I mean, when the telescope is, we've got 2 phases done. So once we keep moving, the benefits will apply for the rest of the Wadri people.
Yep, fantastic. And any other questions? Yep.
Hi, thank you. I'm Michael Goodsight from the University of Adelaide on Kaurna country. I'm really curious with the research infrastructure partnerships that we're developing at the university. What are key components of those to integrate into our reconciliation action plans, or are they just, should we keep thoughts of them separate, or just put them in when they happen naturally because we're on country? Thank you.
So for those not here, the reconciliation action plans, and we should get Louisa Warren to talk about these. They're a way of bringing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people together with non-Indigenous organisations. And like, for example, at CSIRO, one of our initiatives is actually how do we build a data governance, Indigenous data governance framework. And so that would be an initiative that our organisation has out there, and it's also led by an organisation called Reconciliation Australia, which you put in this plan and it gets approved, and then from that they keep track of like your milestones to make sure that you're meeting these milestones in which the organisation has. So I'm not sure with that question if you have anything similar to that in your countries to help promote reconciliation, and if you see that these infrastructures projects can be supported through that.
Do you want me to try
Yes,
it?
try.
In Norway now, the government decided to have 17 points to reconciliations with Sami people. The Sami parliament, in Scandinavian countries, we all have our own Sami parliament. So the Sami parliament had a suggestion of 5 points, while the government put up 17 points. So what has been taken away from the Sami wishes was this thing about rights. Who has the rightful owners of the land? How can land be used in a way that is sustainable? The second thing that was taken away from the government was this about businesses. How can we strengthen all types of businesses? Fishery, reindeer herding, outcomes from the nature. So a question of how research could come in and do something. My advice would be that research should go to the Sami people or the Indigenous people and ask, what do you want, instead of looking at the things that the governments have put in. Because that's where research could do something to help the Indigenous groups. Was that the answer?
And any other panel like to expand? Happy?
Yeah, I'm not too sure whether this sort of connects. I mean, there are a lot of, you know, we've got a government that is trying to unravel a lot of rights at the moment. So I don't know whether you've heard the Treaty Principles Bill. It's trying to define what the Treaty of Waitangi Principles are. So this is stipulative in order to erode Indigenous rights and so forth. So we're kind of going, you know, we're having a bit of we're in a context that's more divisive. I do, when you're talking about researchers going out and working, framing research problems around what communities want, certainly support that. But also one thing that is unfortunate, they also cancelled the Māori Health Authority, but that was putting resources into communities. So it was focusing on, giving communities, organisations, resources to do what they need to do. And there's been a little bit more of that in the data space as well. So, having marae sort of community hubs, tribal ones, do census work and stuff like that. So handing over more of the responsibilities and, giving the technical means for Indigenous groups to do that themselves, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I am Saud Sagala from Indonesia. I would like to ask, or maybe to share from my perspective as well and get your comments. When we talk about indigenous community from our experience or the context of Indonesia, it's not a single group, but it can be many because of the size of the country, for example, and the complexities there. For example, when we talk about watershed, we can have a number of indigenous people along this watershed, and then the interests are different. Whether you have any, encounter any this kind of situation and how to bring them together, because it's not easy to do that. Second is, you touched upon about language earlier. My research is on resilience, and to have resilience translated into Indonesian language and even further to more local language, it has difficulties. So it's also difficult for us to come up with the same goal, on climate change, for example, in the globally and also at local context. Maybe any of you of the experts here can share about your experience in, bringing the language something to be a local, local context. Thank you.
Auntie, did you want to talk about how you've brought language into your project?
We have a language centre that we work with when we, under the MRO Ilua, we have 36 telescopes, satellite dishes, out on site. And each of those satellites have a Wadri name to it. So they've been working with the Wadri people for the language, because Wadri language is only just slowly getting back into the school. So we always refer back to the language centre where they're developing the Wadri language back to give back to the people. So it's stored in just a language centre in Geraldton.
And how does that make you feel and your community feel about having those languages implemented in the work that you're doing?
It makes me feel really good. My father's 80 years old. He speaks Wadri fluent, and he's always talking. And we have a couple of elders in our community that still speak the language. So for my father, it's good because just a bit of history. 1999 is when we started our native title journey. He was actually one of the people that started us on that road in 1999, and so he's survived to see the end result. So yeah, it's good. I mean, language is important, but as you know, language was stolen from the people, so it's hard to come back to that. So if we can savour every bit of language that we have, it's great. Yeah.
Thank you. And your dad sounds amazing, that long journey of native title and starting that. Yeah. And Nicholas, did you have anything further?
I would try to answer your question that if we go to Sápmi, we see that my people is divided up in 4 countries. We have 10 languages. And one thing that makes us to be one unit is that we all think about resilience and sustainability. So we cannot look at Sápmi as a whole, one answer for all these questions. We have to go into the local communities and try to find the solution that starts from sustainability and then see local solutions. So there is not one universal answer, but the answer is you must find the solution in a local area.
And how about for you, Daniel? Because I noticed that over there the Māori language is really strong when I visited. So how does that, language translate into the research over there?
Yeah, well, different to here because, you know, you might have different dialects, but at least there's mutual understanding. But as Nicholas was saying, you have local challenges. And the first part of the question was also about, you know, different interests as well competing, which also plays out. I mean, you're in a politicised environment, so there's, you know, a lot of back and forth and discussion that can go on sometimes for very long periods of time.
Fantastic. And there was another question, I think, just up the...
Yes, thank you. I'm Andrea. I am the International Relations Officer of an European life science data research infrastructure. And part of my job is trying to think how can we collaborate with other regions. And I think lots of the knowledge that has been shared can also be applied to the cooperation between Global North and Global South. So my question to you, from your own experiences, what would be your advice for me to be able to earn the trust from those regions that may perceive that what we do is a little bit of helicopter science? We go there, we try to collaborate with them in a way that makes us look good, but they have this feeling that we are not really helping them to, you know, build their capacity building, their research. So what would be your advice from that experience on building mutually beneficial partnerships with other regions?
Would anybody like to go first? Daniel? It looks like you've been dumped
Well,
in.
I mean, so, you know, there is this sort of description of 1,000 cups of teas to get on the same page. I mean, it just takes time to build up a relationship, but ensure that you have discussions where everybody gets on the same page about what's involved, what benefits go to whom, you know, what knowledge is protected, and all these kinds of things. I don't know that there's a shortcut. Somebody has to have the cups of teas, right?
And one more question up the front here.
Hi, Pascal Perez, Director of the Australian Urban Research Infrastructure Network. Fantastic panel discussion. Trust, as at the core of trust, there's respect. Respect of communities and individuals. And what you're telling us is a story that you cannot go beyond the individual. So beyond the intrinsic rights and sovereignty of indigenous communities, do you see a potential for the work you're doing and the hard-won battles you've won to be a gift back to society at large? Because this is the way that every individual, every community in your countries and around the world should be treated from a research perspective, regardless of who we are. So are you the template for the future, basically?
Anybody? Nicola?
I feel like a small part, you know, given, you know, the luminaries who have also spoken earlier as well. I'm just a small part in a larger, you know, movement, right? And I think there will be, you know, benefits. There are lots of opportunities, I think, you know, for our small country to reframe what's being done in ways that work for everyone. I think that's quite a positive thing, but I feel like a small part of that, yeah.
I think that I can take an example. We had a project together with Abisko Research Station, and back in 1989, we saw that something was happening in the nature. Reindeer grazing was starting to be worse. The winds were changing. And we had a project meeting at the research station. One of my older uncles started to talk with all researchers at the station and explaining how the winds work in February. And then the leader of this research institute, Terry Callaghan, he went to his staff and said, can you go back and follow up these wind directions for the last 50 years, 100 years? And of course, something happened with the winds. So what we can all do small steps. Nobody will take the big solutions. But we can start to see old data, for example, with new eyes. We can learn something new from things that we've collected for so many years by using indigenous knowledge into this data framework. So in one way, we can increase our knowledge about nature by adding a new level, the indigenous knowledge about it.
It's a very, very great point, and it's a great opening into the next sort of question as well. So with the protection of knowledge comes the protection of Indigenous data. So how can research infrastructures be designed to balance the protection of Indigenous data, privacy and sovereignty with the need for open data access and reuse to maximise innovation and impact? And I think some of the panel touched on that today, so it'd be really great to hear your thoughts as well.
Well, yes, there are a number of descriptions of various tools that could be used. So, traditional knowledge labels, for instance, that was being talked about earlier on. I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago. It was in relation to an archaeological association database. And one particular tribe had attached traditional knowledge labels and adapted them. They went through a process with their community of talking about what should the wording for these labels be, because you can do that. So there's this, control, but description, but also shared community discussion about how you represent your knowledge or control what's being put out there. How can research infrastructure be designed? I mean, that's one example. But there are all sorts of elements related to policy and process. And as I say, even having servers run in tribal areas and handing over hardware. But there's also these technical things, like just thinking about AI, for instance. You don't necessarily want to hand over your data to someone else. How about having things like federated learning? So, you have systems set up so you can have models be trained without giving up control of the data, and even being able to withdraw consent. So, technical research into machine unlearning in order to, give effect to these kinds of consent or, even removal of consent processes. There's just a couple of things.
Mm. It's really important about getting consent and the free, prior, informed consent before starting projects. And does any of the other panel like to add onto that question before we flip it to the audience?
I could add an example that in the Norwegian system, we have all the Sami place names. So they are like open for everybody. There's nothing secret with them. But within within these databases, we have the places that we don't want to put in the coordinates on. Seitit, the secret places. So they are in the database, but those parts of the database are closed. So you can build up systems with some open data and some closed data. And these are national systems in archaeology.
Fantastic.
Speaking of heritage data, what do people always own their own? We always own our own heritage and the data that comes from it. But when you work in big projects, you have to share that data as an end result because we have heritage, cultural heritage sites out there. So when the people go out, they do that. We have to pass on that data, and we pass it on to the people that we work with, and that's CSIRO. So, but at the end of the day, we are the keeper of our own data, but we just choose to share the knowledge. And it always stays safe because at the end of the day, if we pass our data over, we can always go back to them and ask them, people can access the data. It's not locked away where nobody can get to it.
And you set up those agreements whilst in that negotiating of the 8 years?
Yeah, we do. We have that
terms.
Cultural Heritage Management Plan, and that's the one that keeps it
safe.
Yeah.
Yep. And accessible. Does anybody in the audience have some questions around data access, use and accessibility? Or data sovereignty? Got crickets. Crickets now. All right, well, we're on to our final question. Oh, sorry, you had one more question? Oh. Other one.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, me again. I think from Maggie's presentation this morning, what struck me was one word, about. It's not only data from, it's not data with, because we know more or less how to handle that if you trust and you respect. But the data about, from the research perspective, that's the nasty one, because sometimes you're going to deal with, you're going to capture data about people or about places, but you don't know that they relate to communities because you don't have the knowledge for that. So how can we handle that issue, the data about, when the researcher genuinely doesn't know that there's someone out there or a community out there they should talk to in the first place?
More Indigenous scientists. Hire more Indigenous. It's that capability development. Because it's also, the data about, their sort of mainstream ways of framing particular issues. So even thinking about health, that might be individual focused, might be a lot of clinical data, but from an Indigenous perspective, you might be looking at a more holistic framing that includes a lot more factors that just aren't collected. So how could you create Indigenous AI in a system that's not interested in collecting data about families, about cultural engagement, use of language, and so forth? Yeah.
And just quickly, because I can see other people starting to filter in from the other room. So for the panel members, just one takeaway that you would like this research community to leave with today. And we'll start down the end with you, Niklaus.
Indigenous people live in local places, so we must start from the local places. We cannot start from the top.
I think just inclusion and involvement from the beginning to the end. So if we always have the inclusion, we're going to keep flowing.
I'll just reiterate what I was just saying before. More Indigenous researchers would really help in lots of ways. So,
fantastic, everybody. Thanks so much for today. And if you'd like to put your hands together for our panel.